All right, dudes and dudettes, we're back to talk about starting the Cold War, and we'll talk about some of the U.S. plans and the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. But just stay tuned. Here we go. All right, so we're talking about primarily just between the years 1945, 1947. Try to take this, and chunk it up a little bit because it is quite extensive because it lasted for a long time. All right, so when I talk about stages of the Cold War, I'm talking about, of course, 41, 45. We were still in World War II, and basically it was no choice but to work with the Soviet Union, the USA, to defeat Germany. All right, and so the second part is when we're going to look at the 1946 to 1953, which basically deals with disagreements between the USA and Soviet Union over what to do in Germany, over issues in Germany and Eastern Europe also. And also, there's this developing nuclear arms race. All right. 54 to 68, there were fluctuating relations. There are a lot of issues that are now spreading to other continents and other parts of the world, as we'll see in Korea, China, Vietnam, and so forth and so on. And detente basically sort of like this cooling off period. The USA and Soviet Union, they reached several agreements in an effort to avoid war. Um, 75 to 80, 79 to 85, we're going to see more decline in the relationship between the two. All right. And this is basically over efforts in what we refer to as today developing nations. You hear other people call it the third world, but that's common. We don't refer to that anymore. It's developed and developing. And then, of course, 85 and 91 is sort of ending this Cold War period of cooperation and breaking up of the Soviet Union empire. All right, so we have to start with the ideological basis for this um, clash. All right, you have on one hand communism, all right, which is like the ultimate political and social state. And we haven't we call it communist all the time, but we've yet to have a true communist state. All right, but when we refer to the idea of communist, it's the social and economic system, of course, which is based on the collective ownership, control, and self management of all major parts of an economy. So we're talking about land, industry, banks. All right, it's all collectively owned by the whole, not just the wealthy capitalist class. And you don't get a share of what you do in the true communist state based off of your input. All right, it's totally classless, and it would be preceded by a socialist stage of development, and that's probably the main stage that most of when we talk about communists, that's socialism. All right, so capitalism, on the other hand, is that social and economic system, of course, that we know and part of inherent in American culture and a lot of Western powers, private ownerships of all major parts of an economy. All right, so it's not necessarily by. It can be considered by a part of like a ruling minority class, so to speak, or certain individuals that hold all the wealth, but it's private enterprises make all the important decisions, and they're sort of like um, a free market or open economy. All right, so everyone can have a say. All right, it's not based off of some centralized or central agency controlling or even the government controlling matters of the economy. All right. So the state has no say. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, there is no truly capitalist society. All right. So, I mean, when you think about it, uh, we have, in the USA, we have some agencies that are part of the economy that sort of have, and we have lots of laws and some kind of government oversight in some things. All right. And so that's the true difference. These are two ideological extremes. All right. So basically, what this all boiled down to was an important aspect was the ideology and the propaganda. All right. So each side sort of had to portray the opposite side as being negative and the worst side, and of course, vice versa. All right. So the Soviet Union believed that capitalism was a lot of competition, and the whole idea of capitalism and free trade and free market, it ultimately leads to a lot of economic crises, and which ultimately can go on to regional and global wars. All right. So basically, they believe that in order to overcome all of these economic crises, is to truly become, and world peace is to truly become the socialist or communist society. So now the USA, of course, on the other hand, believe that this market economy that we have, um, and individual political rights, all right, would secure food and living standards for all. So um, the only way to get to world peace would be to contain and roll back communism wherever it existed. So basically, the ideology coming from the U.S. was the fact that we should have political rights. We should have a free market, open economy, and that would secure the standards and needs for all. All right. So of course we know that this is a long struggle, this Cold War period over 50 years, the West versus the East, as you'll see it referred to as. All right. And of course, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were considered mainly the superpowers because of their economic and military resources. All right, and they really could dictate and control and use uh, their level of as a superpower, quote unquote, to dictate the international events and of others. All right, but one thing that's true is that the term superpower is used lightly. All right. The Soviet Union, on one hand, after 1945, as you see here, was a regional power in Europe. All right. No doubt about that. They wanted friendly states on its borders and economic reconstruction. Now, the United States, on the other hand, they weren't just a regional superpower. The United States had a global impact. All right. They had greater economic and military power. All right. And the USA, on the other hand, they wanted the entire world, of course, open to the free exchange of goods, money, and people. All right. So, um, of course, the big three at Yalta. We talked about that in your last set of lecture notes. We talked about the issue of Poland, um, Germany, how to structure the economies of the broken down Germany, and other states, and nuclear weapons. All right. So there was the establishment of communist governments in Eastern Europe. And of course, this is going to alarm the West. All right. Now, this is spreading. And once again, the U.S. and the West, the main issue here is open free markets, um, to allow, private individuals, so to speak, to have say in economy. And it's not just the U.S. economy; it's worldwide, it's global. So the Russians, of course, are going to systematically interfere in a lot of countries in Eastern Europe, and they're going to set up these pro-communist governments. And of course, we see it happen in Poland, Hungary, then Bulgaria, Albania, and Romania. Many people saw this as an alternative to the downward spiral that their economy is going in, and the political instability in their country. And it was just a better alternative to many. And of course, with the support and backing of a major power like regional power, so to speak, of Soviet Union, many people thought that was the appeal. All right, and if they did have any opponents, they were imprisoned or murdered. And so Stalin and his salami tactics basically made sure that the communist governments came to power in all of these countries. All right, and I put a nice little handout in your note to kind of go through that. What that mean. I mean, it's kind of obvious. You slice off a piece of everything until you get everything chopped up the way you like it. All right. So with small pieces, one country at a time. So 1946 is considered a turning point, because now we really have huge issues that are developing between the Allies and the Soviet Union. All right, there were some issues in the Mediterranean and Middle East, but the big issue were the problems that were associated with in Europe. You had Germany, peace treaties with Italy, the emerging civil war in Greece, and atomic weapons. So these are all the different issues that are going on. Kennan. All right, Kennan's long telegram. The background to this, the Western governments that sort of came to view this whole idea of the Soviet control in Eastern Europe as the first step towards this westward spread of communism. Many people in the West felt that, you know, taking over those Eastern European countries, setting up these communist states, would lead to further expansion of West and Soviet sort of influence. So one of the plans that were in place before or developed was the Baruch Plan, and it was a plan to remove Soviet fears about the USA's nuclear control, um, and put all the atomic weapons under international control. But this ended, of course, any hopes of an agreement on control of nuclear weapons. So that failed, and George Kennan is going to his famous long telegraph. He's going to argue. That the security fears, internal politics, leaderships, and all this ideology going on in the USSR would never end, and they would never cooperate with the U.S. All right, and his telegram is really what's going to harden attitudes in the U.S. and it's going to play this major role in foreign policy towards the Soviet Union. All right, so Kennan basically argued that Moscow was highly sensitive and uh, wouldn't back down if it encountered any strong resistance at any point. But he did believe the policy that set up in the Soviet Union was not short lived, and no matter what the U.S. did, that the Soviet Union wouldn't back down. All right. So this really laid the foundation for okay, well, we don't want this sort of spreading and trickling down. It's going to usher in this policy of containment. So basically, the only thing that's left to do now is to keep it where it is and make sure the rest of the world doesn't succumb to this. All right, and to further things deteriorating between the two sides, we have the Iron Curtain speech by Churchill. All right, and from Stettin to the Baltic Sea to Trieste to in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. The Iron Curtain can't kind of cross it. All right. Um, in this claim, he said that they were indefinite expansion of the power and doctrines that Russia was, and that the Western alliance had to stand firm against the communist threat. All right, and of course, this is going to deepen the rift between the East and the West, and to further add insult to injury. Um, this was an important shift away from the spirit of Yalta, of course, the agreement and policy, trying to get along. And it coincided with Kennan's long telegram. But Stalin's going to compare Churchill to Hitler and saw the speech as a call to war with the Soviet Union. So the Soviets withdrew from the International Monetary Fund and they started propping up their anti-West propaganda. All right, I know this is not a clear map, but you can see what he was talking about, places that had already succumbed to communism and those in the West. All right. So we have a lot of economic crises in Western Europe. The economic impact of the Second World War, of course, we know that's going to leave the continent devastated. Um, Poor harvest and poor winters is just going to cause people to really suffer economically. So George C. Marshall, who became the Secretary of State, estimated that Western Europe would need at least 17 million in aid in order to recover. So Truman painted to the American people that the Soviet Union was aggressively expansionist and they needed to be contained, and they're going to set up government agencies to help do that. We have the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Council, NSC, and they're going to issue the Truman Doctrine. All right, and this really primarily dealt with the communists in Greece who were trying to overthrow the monarchy. All right. And they were aided. Actually, the communists were aided by those other communist states of Albania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. But Truman announced that the USA would support free people who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure. So basically, that we would offer any aid to those countries that were willing to resist or any threats of communist takeover. All right. So Greece, of course, received large amounts, and they do defeat the communists. But Truman made it clear that they had no intentions of maintaining any kind of isolationist policies as they did after World War I, and we were going to commit to containing communism throughout the world. One thing about the Truman Doctrine was that it was open to not just those in Western Europe. It was open to any country, theoretically. All right, so we have the economic extension of the Truman Doctrine, and this is going to be proposed under this European Recovery Program, and it offered economic and financial help wherever it needed. So it was to promote the economic recovery of Europe, ensuring markets for American exports. So uh, it was basically, if the economy was prospering and people were happy, then the threat of communism would subside. It wouldn't be an issue. All right? And this was the political motivation behind this plan. So, in theory, like I said before, this aid was offered to other countries. It wasn't just Western Europe, quote unquote. Of course, the Soviet Union was going to reject the offer, and neither the satellite states nor Czechoslovakia, which did show a little interest, were allowed to take advantage of it. The Iron Curtain seemed a reality. And yes, I know I did spell iron wrong. But there you have it, my friends.